The courthouse steps felt cold beneath Sarah Chen's worn sneakers as she climbed toward the heavy oak doors. Her faded jeans and simple gray sweater drew disapproving glances from the suited lawyers streaming past her. She kept her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her posture straight despite the weight of exhaustion that had settled into her bones over the past few months. The security checkpoint buzzed with morning activity. Sarah placed her small purse on the conveyor belt and stepped through the metal detector without incident. The guard barely glanced at her identification before waving her through. Just another civilian with a minor court appearance, nothing worth noting. Courtroom 3B hummed with the quiet efficiency of morning proceedings. Sarah found a seat in the back row, her eyes scanning the familiar theater of justice. The mahogany-paneled walls rose to meet an ornate ceiling that spoke of taxpayer dollars and judicial dignity. She had been in courtrooms before, but never as the defendant. Judge Harrison swept into the room with the dramatic flair of a man who had grown comfortable with his own authority. His black robes billowed behind him as he settled into the elevated chair that physically reinforced his position above everyone else. Silver hair crowned a face that had spent decades looking down at people both literally and figuratively. The morning docket moved with mechanical precision. Traffic violations, minor drug possession, petty theft. Each case received roughly the same treatment from Judge Harrison, a mixture of impatience and condescension that suggested he had better places to be. Sarah watched the pattern emerge, noting how his tone shifted depending on the defendant's appearance and apparent social status. When her case was called, Sarah rose and walked to the defendant's table. Her attorney, a public defender who looked like he had graduated law school the previous week, shuffled through papers with nervous energy. The prosecutor, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an expensive suit, regarded Sarah with professional disinterest. State versus Chen, Judge Harrison announced, consulting his papers with theatrical precision. He looked up at Sarah over his reading glasses, taking in her appearance with obvious disappointment. A simple assault charge, I see. Another case of civilian violence, no doubt fueled by too much television and not enough common sense. Sarah remained silent, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She had learned long ago that initial impressions mattered less than final outcomes. The judge's assumption about her background was both predictable and irrelevant to the truth of what had happened that night outside the convenience store. Where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Sarah wondered as she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her from the gallery. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. Somewhere beyond these walls, people were beginning their days, unaware that in this small corner of the justice system, assumptions were about to collide with reality in ways that would surprise everyone present. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, studying the case file with the exaggerated attention of a man performing for an audience. The charges stem from an incident outside Martinez convenience store, he read aloud, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. The defendant allegedly assaulted 3 men who were, according to witnesses, simply minding their own business. Sarah's young attorney cleared his throat nervously. Your Honor, my client was acting in self-defense. The 3 individuals in question were harassing an elderly woman in the parking lot. Ms. Chen intervened to protect her. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose skeptically. Ms. Chen, he said, turning his attention to Sarah with barely concealed amusement. You expect this court to believe that you, a woman of what, maybe 130 pounds, successfully defended yourself against 3 grown men. His tone suggested he found the very idea absurd. The prosecutor shuffled her papers, clearly uncomfortable with the judge's editorial commentary. Your Honor, the facts of the case are somewhat unclear. The 3 alleged victims have provided conflicting statements, and there is security camera footage that has not yet been fully analyzed. Judge Harrison waved dismissively at the prosecutor's attempt at nuance. Ms. Chen, he continued, focusing his attention back on Sarah, what is your background? Are you some sort of martial arts enthusiast? Did you learn your fighting techniques from watching too many action movies? Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression neutral. Her hands stayed clasped behind her back, a posture that looked respectful to the casual observer but served a different purpose entirely. She had learned to control her breathing, her heart rate, her facial expressions in situations far more intense than this courthouse theater. "I served in the military, Your Honor," Sarah replied quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach every corner of the courtroom. Judge Harrison's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Ah yes, the military. Let me guess, you were a cook, or perhaps a clerk. Maybe you handled supplies or worked in communications." His voice dripped with condescension as he continued. "The modern military has certainly changed from my day, when service meant something more than playing dress-up and collecting benefits." The courtroom gallery stirred uneasily. Several people shifted in their seats, sensing the judge's comments had crossed a line. Sarah's attorney looked like he wanted to object but seemed unsure of the proper procedure for challenging a judge's obvious bias. "Your Honor," the young lawyer finally managed, "my client's military service record is exemplary. She served with distinction and received multiple commendations for her dedication and skill." Judge Harrison's smile was patronizing. "I'm sure she received a ribbon for showing up on time," he said, generating a few uncomfortable chuckles from the gallery. "But this court deals with reality, not military participation trophies. The simple fact remains that this defendant claims to have single-handedly defeated 3 men in combat. The very notion is preposterous." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a familiar sensation she had not experienced in months. It was the quiet anger that had sustained her through impossible missions, the controlled fury that had kept her alive when others had not been so fortunate. But she also felt something else, something that surprised her. She felt curious about how far this man would push his assumptions before reality intervened. "Have you ever witnessed someone surprise everyone with hidden talents?" she thought, watching Judge Harrison's face as he continued his performance. The morning light continued to stream through the courthouse windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny secrets waiting to be revealed. Soon, very soon, this room would understand that appearances could be the most dangerous deception of all. The prosecutor stood, her discomfort with the proceedings becoming more apparent with each passing moment. "Your Honor, I would like to present the security footage from the convenience store. The video clearly shows the sequence of events that led to the charges against Ms. Chen." Judge Harrison gestured impatiently toward the bailiff, who wheeled a small television monitor to face the courtroom. The grainy black and white footage began to play, showing the parking lot outside Martinez convenience store at night. Street lights cast harsh shadows across the pavement, creating a stark landscape of light and darkness. On the screen, 3 men could be seen surrounding an elderly woman near her car. Their body language was unmistakably aggressive, blocking her path and gesturing in ways that suggested intimidation rather than friendly conversation. The woman appeared frightened, clutching her purse tightly against her chest as she tried to move away from them. Then Sarah appeared at the edge of the frame, walking with a casual gait that seemed almost leisurely given the situation unfolding before her. She approached the group without hurrying, her movements fluid and controlled in ways that the poor video quality could not fully capture. Judge Harrison leaned forward, squinting at the monitor. "Well, Ms. Chen, I see you inserting yourself into a situation that was none of your business. Tell me, what military training prepares someone to be a neighborhood vigilante?" Sarah watched her recorded self move closer to the confrontation. The men had not noticed her approach initially, focused as they were on intimidating the elderly woman. When she finally spoke to them, requesting that they leave the woman alone, their reaction was swift and predictable. "Your Honor," Sarah's attorney interjected, "my client clearly attempted to de-escalate the situation verbally before any physical contact occurred." The video showed the 3 men turning their attention to Sarah, their postures becoming more aggressive as they realized she intended to interfere. Words were exchanged, though the security camera captured no audio. The elderly woman used the distraction to move toward the store entrance, where she appeared to be calling for help. What happened next occurred with such speed that Judge Harrison had to ask the bailiff to replay the sequence. Sarah moved with a precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics as understood by civilian observers. The first man reached for her, and suddenly he was on the ground. The second man lunged forward, and he too found himself sprawled across the asphalt. The third man hesitated for a crucial moment before attempting to flee, but Sarah's movement intercepted him with the efficiency of someone who had performed similar actions countless times before. Judge Harrison blinked at the screen, then looked at Sarah with an expression that had shifted from condescension to puzzlement. "Ms. Chen," he said slowly, "exactly what type of military training did you receive?" Sarah felt the familiar weight of classified information pressing against her consciousness. There were things she could say and things she could never say, boundaries drawn by oaths that transcended any civilian courtroom. She had learned to navigate these waters carefully, revealing only what was necessary while protecting the secrets that could never be shared. "I received combat training, Your Honor," she replied simply. "Combat training," Judge Harrison repeated, his tone suggesting he remained skeptical despite the evidence playing on the screen before him. "And exactly where did this combat training take place? What unit were you assigned to?" The questions hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah recognized the moment when assumptions would begin their collision with reality. The morning sun had shifted, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the courtroom floor. Soon, very soon, this room would understand that some questions opened doors that were better left closed. Sarah's silence stretched across the courtroom like a taut wire. She understood that Judge Harrison expected an immediate answer, the kind of detailed military resume that would satisfy his curiosity and restore his sense of control over the proceedings. But there were protocols that superseded his authority, clearances that existed in shadows this civilian court would never penetrate. "I served where I was needed, Your Honor," Sarah finally replied, her voice carrying a finality that suggested the topic was closed. Judge Harrison's face reddened slightly. "Ms. Chen, this court requires complete honesty from all parties. Your evasive answers do nothing to support your credibility." He gestured toward the frozen video screen, where the image showed all three men sprawled across the parking lot pavement. "This footage shows someone with training far beyond what most soldiers receive." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Your Honor, perhaps we should focus on the legal aspects of the case rather than the defendant's complete military history. The relevant question is whether her actions constituted reasonable self-defense and defense of others." Judge Harrison's attention snapped to the prosecutor with irritation. "Counselor, I will determine what is relevant in my courtroom." He turned back to Sarah, his voice taking on the imperious tone of someone accustomed to having his questions answered without delay. "Ms. Chen, what was your military occupational specialty?" Sarah felt the weight of oaths sworn in rooms that officially did not exist, promises made to protect operations that had never happened according to any public record. The men and women she had served alongside understood these boundaries instinctively. They lived in a world where silence was not evasion but necessity, where some truths were too dangerous for civilian consumption. "I was assigned to special operations," she said carefully, choosing words that revealed nothing while technically answering the question. "Special operations," Judge Harrison repeated, his skepticism evident in every syllable. "And what exactly did these special operations entail? Were you some sort of military police officer? A security guard perhaps?" The gallery had grown completely silent, sensing that something significant was unfolding before them. Sarah's attorney looked increasingly nervous, clearly out of his depth in waters that involved classified military service. Even the court reporter had paused her constant typing, her fingers hovering over the keys as she waited for Sarah's response. "Your Honor," Sarah replied with the same measured tone she had maintained throughout the proceedings, "many aspects of my service remain classified. I am not authorized to discuss operational details in an open civilian court." Judge Harrison's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Classified," he said, shaking his head with theatrical disbelief. "Ms. Chen, this is not a spy novel. This is a court of law where citizens are expected to answer direct questions about their backgrounds. Your continued evasion suggests you have something to hide." Sarah recognized the moment when civilian authority collided with military necessity. She had navigated similar situations before, though usually with people who understood the implications of security clearances and classified operations. Judge Harrison clearly belonged to a different category entirely, someone who had never encountered the boundaries that governed her world. The morning light continued to shift through the tall courthouse windows, casting new patterns across the polished floor. Sarah noticed how the shadows moved with predictable precision, following laws of physics that never changed regardless of human assumptions or judicial authority. Some things remained constant even when everything else was about to change. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "there are phone numbers you can call to verify my service record. People who can confirm what I am authorized to discuss and what must remain protected. But those conversations will not happen in this courtroom, and they will not happen today." Judge Harrison stared at her with growing frustration, realizing that his usual tools of intimidation and authority were proving ineffective against someone who operated under different rules entirely. Judge Harrison removed his glasses and cleaned them with deliberate slowness, a gesture designed to demonstrate his patience wearing thin. The courtroom remained unnaturally quiet, as if the very air had grown heavy with unspoken tension. He replaced his glasses and fixed Sarah with a stare that had intimidated countless defendants over his 20-year career on the bench. "Ms. Chen," he began, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room, "I have been presiding over cases in this courthouse since before you were probably old enough to vote. I have seen every type of defendant, heard every excuse, witnessed every attempt to avoid accountability through misdirection and manufactured mystery." Sarah remained motionless, her breathing so controlled it appeared she might not be breathing at all. The morning sun had shifted higher, sending new angles of light across the mahogany paneling and illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to the unfolding drama. "You stand before this court claiming to have classified military experience," Judge Harrison continued, his tone growing more theatrical with each word. "You refuse to answer direct questions about your service, hiding behind claims of secrecy and special authorization. This behavior is not only disrespectful to this court but insulting to the genuine heroes who have served our country with honor and transparency." The prosecutor glanced nervously between Sarah and the judge, clearly recognizing that the proceedings had veered far from normal legal territory. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, sensing that Judge Harrison's personal frustrations were now driving the courtroom rather than legal procedure. Furthermore, the judge declared, rising from his chair to tower above the courtroom from his elevated position, "Your alleged combat skills, as demonstrated in that convenient security footage, suggest someone who has received training far beyond what any legitimate military program would provide to someone of your apparent background and qualifications." Sarah felt something she had not experienced in months, a familiar tightening in her chest that occurred when operations began to spiral beyond acceptable parameters. She recognized the signs of a situation requiring immediate recalibration, the moment when careful planning collided with unpredictable human variables. What would you do if you were in this situation, she wondered silently, watching Judge Harrison's face flush with the righteousness of someone convinced of his own moral authority. The question hung in her mind like a tactical assessment, weighing options and consequences with the precision of someone trained to make life-or-death decisions in seconds. "Your Honor," Sarah's attorney finally found his voice, "I must object to this line of questioning. My client's military service record, classified or otherwise, has no bearing on whether her actions constituted lawful defense of herself and another person." Judge Harrison's attention snapped to the young lawyer with volcanic intensity. "Counselor, your client's credibility is absolutely relevant to this case. If she is lying about her military background, if she is fabricating stories about classified operations and special training, then this court must consider whether her entire testimony is suspect." The bailiff, a veteran himself judging by his bearing and the way he had been watching Sarah throughout the proceedings, stepped closer to his position near the judge's bench. His movement was subtle but significant, the unconscious adjustment of someone who sensed the atmosphere in the room was changing in ways that might require professional attention. Sarah noticed the bailiff's movement and recognized it for what it was, the instinctive positioning of someone with tactical awareness. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she felt a flicker of something approaching respect for another person present. The bailiff understood things that Judge Harrison clearly did not, boundaries that existed beyond civilian comprehension. The morning was advancing toward noon, and somewhere in the world, people were making decisions that would never reach public knowledge, operations that would never appear in any official record, sacrifices that would never receive recognition in rooms like this one. Judge Harrison descended from his elevated chair and began pacing behind the bench, his robes flowing dramatically as he moved. The gesture was calculated to demonstrate his complete control over the proceedings, his authority to move freely while everyone else remained fixed in their assigned positions. His voice carried across the silent courtroom with the confidence of someone who had never encountered genuine opposition to his will. "Ms. Chen, I am going to make this very simple for you," he announced, stopping his pacing to face her directly. "You will provide this court with complete details of your military service, including unit assignments, dates of deployment, and specific training programs. You will do this now, or I will hold you in contempt and remand you to custody until you decide to cooperate with this court's authority." Sarah felt the familiar weight of impossible choices, the moment when competing loyalties created scenarios with no perfect solutions. She had faced similar crossroads in places that did not appear on any map, making decisions that would affect people who would never know her name or understand the price of their safety. The bailiff had moved again, positioning himself where he could observe both Sarah and Judge Harrison with equal attention. His hand rested casually near his radio, the unconscious gesture of someone prepared for situations that might escalate beyond verbal conflict. Sarah noticed his wedding ring, worn thin by years of wear, and wondered if he had children who asked questions about his work that he could never fully answer. "Your Honor," the prosecutor rose slowly, her professional composure beginning to crack under the weight of the proceedings she was witnessing. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess to allow all parties to consult appropriate authorities regarding the defendant's military service verification." Judge Harrison's response was swift and dismissive. "Counselor, there will be no recess. There will be no consultation with mysterious authorities. There will only be truth, spoken plainly in this courtroom, or there will be consequences for contempt of court." Sarah understood that the moment of decision had arrived with the inevitability of sunrise. She had spent months trying to blend into civilian life, to become invisible among people who would never understand the world she had inhabited. But invisibility required cooperation from others, and Judge Harrison had made cooperation impossible. "Have you ever witnessed someone surprise everyone with hidden talents?" she thought, feeling the weight of secrets that had shaped her entire adult life. The morning light had shifted again, casting different shadows across the courtroom floor, illuminating corners that had been dark moments before. "Your Honor," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a new quality that made everyone in the courtroom unconsciously lean forward to hear her words more clearly, "I have served my country in ways that require authorization levels beyond this court's jurisdiction to discuss. What I can tell you is that the three men in that parking lot made a choice to threaten an innocent person, and I made a choice to stop them." Judge Harrison's face flushed darker with each word. "Ms. Chen, your dramatic speeches about serving your country do not excuse your refusal to answer direct questions. You are not above the law, regardless of whatever fantasies you may have constructed about your supposed military service." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a familiar sensation that preceded moments when careful control gave way to operational necessity. She had reached the boundary where civilian rules collided with deeper truths, where polite cooperation became impossible without betraying oaths that transcended any earthly authority. The courtroom had grown so quiet that the sound of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud, marking seconds that felt like they were stretching towards some inevitable conclusion that everyone could sense but no one could name. The silence that followed Judge Harrison's ultimatum stretched across the courtroom like a physical presence. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back, weighing decisions that would ripple far beyond this single room. She had learned to calculate risk with mathematical precision, to evaluate consequences across multiple scenarios simultaneously, but civilian life had introduced variables she was still learning to navigate. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying a different tone now, one that made the bailiff straighten slightly and the court reporter pause, her fingers above the keys, "I understand your frustration with my responses. But there are protocols that govern what I can and cannot discuss about my service, protocols that exist for reasons beyond any individual court proceeding. Judge Harrison's patience finally snapped completely. Ms. Chen, I am ordering you to answer my questions fully and completely. Your so-called protocols have no authority in this courtroom. I am the authority here, and I am telling you that your evasions end now. The bailiff took another subtle step closer, his eyes moving between Sarah and Judge Harrison with the careful attention of someone who recognized dangerous currents flowing beneath the surface of what appeared to be a simple legal proceeding. His hand had moved closer to his radio, though his posture remained professionally neutral. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down, the heightened awareness that preceded moments when everything changed irrevocably. She had experienced this sensation in desert compounds and mountain caves, in situations where the wrong word or gesture could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Your Honor, she said, her voice now carrying an edge that had not been present before, there are people in this country who sleep safely in their beds because of work that happens in places they will never know about, done by people whose names they will never learn. Some secrets exist not to hide shame but to protect the very people who demand to know them. The courtroom gallery had grown completely still, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Judge Harrison's face had turned an alarming shade of red, his hands gripping the edge of his bench as if he needed the physical support to maintain his composure. Ms. Chen, he said through gritted teeth, your theatrical speeches about mysterious service and unnamed heroes do not impress this court. You are either going to answer my questions about your military background, or you are going to be held in contempt. The choice is yours, but you will make it now. Sarah looked at Judge Harrison for a long moment, then let her gaze sweep across the courtroom, taking in the faces of people who had no idea they were about to witness the collision between two entirely different worlds. The morning sun had reached its peak, casting stark shadows that divided the room into areas of brilliant light and deep darkness. What would you do if you were standing at the crossroads between duty and truth, she wondered silently, feeling the weight of oaths sworn in rooms that officially did not exist. Sometimes the greatest service required the greatest sacrifice, and sometimes that sacrifice was the very anonymity that made the service possible. Your Honor, Sarah said finally, her voice now carrying the quiet authority of someone who had made decisions in circumstances far more consequential than any civilian courtroom, if you insist on complete disclosure of my military service record, then I will need you to clear this courtroom of all civilians and contact the Department of Defense Security Office for clearance verification before I can proceed. Judge Harrison stared at her with an expression that mixed fury and growing uncertainty, realizing that her response had just introduced complications he had never encountered in 2 decades of judicial proceedings. Judge Harrison's face went through several shades of color as Sarah's words settled over the courtroom like a blanket of implications he had not anticipated. The mention of Department of Defense security clearance verification had introduced a level of complexity that his 20 years of judicial experience had never prepared him to handle. His grip on the bench tightened as he realized that his simple assault case had just transformed into something far beyond his understanding. Ms. Chen, he said slowly, his voice lacking the confident authority that had characterized his earlier pronouncements, are you suggesting that this court lacks the jurisdiction to hear testimony about your military service? Sarah remained perfectly still, her posture unchanged since the proceedings began. Your Honor, I am suggesting that certain aspects of military service fall under federal security protocols that supersede local court authority. If you require full disclosure, then proper channels must be followed to ensure national security is not compromised. The prosecutor had gone pale, clearly recognizing that the simple assault case she had expected to handle before lunch had just evolved into something requiring expertise she did not possess. The defense attorney looked equally overwhelmed, staring at his client as if seeing her for the first time since accepting her case. The bailiff had moved again, this time positioning himself where he could see both the gallery and the main participants in the unfolding drama. His radio crackled softly with routine courthouse communications, but his attention remained fixed on Sarah with the intensity of someone who had begun to suspect that routine had just left the building. Your Honor, the prosecutor finally found her voice, perhaps we should consider postponing these proceedings until appropriate military liaisons can be consulted. This case may require expertise beyond what this court typically handles. Judge Harrison's jaw worked silently for several moments, his pride warring with the growing realization that he had wandered into territory where his authority might not extend as far as he had assumed. The courtroom remained unnaturally quiet, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, but no one knew exactly what that something was. "Ms. Chen," Judge Harrison said finally, his tone now more cautious than commanding, "exactly what level of security clearance are we discussing here? Are you claiming to have been involved in classified operations that would require federal oversight to discuss in any legal proceeding?" Sarah felt the familiar weight of choices that would echo far beyond the immediate moment. She had spent years learning to navigate the narrow space between truth and necessity, between duty to country and obligation to justice. The morning light streaming through the courthouse windows seemed different now, sharper somehow, as if the very air had changed quality. "Your Honor," she replied carefully, "I am saying that if you require me to discuss operational details of my military service, then this courtroom will need to be secured and appropriate authorization obtained from federal security agencies. Some information cannot be shared in open civilian forums regardless of judicial demands." The implications of her words rippled through the courtroom like waves spreading across still water. Judge Harrison looked around his domain, the familiar space that had always represented the absolute extent of his authority, and realized that he might have encountered something that existed beyond those boundaries. The wall clock continued its steady marking of time, but the rhythm seemed different now, as if the very passage of seconds had taken on new significance. Somewhere in the distance, a phone was ringing in another part of the courthouse, a sound that seemed to come from an entirely different world than the one currently occupying courtroom 3B. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his shifting weight as he struggled to process the implications of Sarah's revelation. The confident authority that had defined his morning had evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that he might have stumbled into waters far deeper than any he had navigated in his judicial career. His hands moved restlessly across the papers on his bench, seeking some familiar anchor in a situation that had spiraled beyond his experience. The courtroom had taken on an almost surreal quality, as if the normal rules of legal proceedings had been suspended in favor of something entirely different. The gallery sat in absolute silence, their morning expectations of routine justice replaced by the growing awareness that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Even the court reporter had stopped her constant typing, her hands frozen above the keys as she waited for guidance that was not forthcoming. "Ms. Chen," Judge Harrison said finally, his voice now stripped of its earlier imperious tone, "I need to understand exactly what we are dealing with here. Are you telling this court that you cannot provide testimony about your background without compromising national security?" Sarah recognized the shift in his tone, the movement from command to inquiry that suggested his worldview was undergoing rapid recalibration. She had seen this transformation before, though usually in briefing rooms where civilian officials first encountered the reality of operations they had only read about in sanitized reports. "Your Honor," she replied with the same measured control she had maintained throughout the morning, "I am saying that full disclosure of my military service record would require security protocols that this courtroom is not equipped to handle. There are aspects of my background that fall under classifications designed to protect both operational security and the safety of personnel still serving in similar capacities." The bailiff had stepped closer to his radio, his body language suggesting he was considering making a call to someone higher in the courthouse hierarchy. His experience had taught him to recognize situations that required expertise beyond what was immediately available, and his instincts were clearly signaling that this case had crossed that threshold. The prosecutor shuffled through her files with nervous energy, clearly searching for some precedent that might guide her through uncharted legal territory. Her training had prepared her for criminal cases, traffic violations, and civil disputes, but nothing in her background had equipped her to handle classified military operations intersecting with civilian justice. "Your Honor," the young defense attorney ventured hesitantly, "perhaps we should request a continuance to allow time for proper consultation with military authorities. This case appears to have complexities that require specialized knowledge." Judge Harrison's frustration was evident in every line of his face, but it was now mixed with something approaching uncertainty. His absolute confidence in his authority had been replaced by the growing realization that authority had limits he had never previously encountered. The morning sun had passed its peak, casting different shadows across the courtroom floor and highlighting the dust motes that continued their endless dance through the air. "Ms. Chen," he said slowly, "I am going to ask you one final question, and I need you to answer it as directly as possible. Can you provide any information about your military service that would help this court understand your qualifications to take the actions you took in that parking lot, without compromising whatever security protocols you believe apply to your situation?" Sarah felt the familiar sensation of standing at a crossroads where every choice led to consequences she could not fully predict. The question was reasonable, the judge's tone had shifted toward genuine inquiry rather than judicial demand, and she recognized the moment when complete silence would serve no one's interests, including her own. Sarah looked at Judge Harrison for a long moment, weighing his final question against the oaths she had sworn in rooms that existed in the shadows between official acknowledgement and operational necessity. The morning light had shifted again, casting the courtroom in stark contrasts that seemed to mirror the choice she faced between continued silence and limited disclosure. "Your Honor," she said quietly, her voice carrying a gravity that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward unconsciously, "I can tell you that I served with distinction in units that operate beyond the scope of conventional military assignments. My training included advanced combat techniques, tactical operations, and specialized skills that few service members ever receive." Judge Harrison nodded slowly, his earlier hostility replaced by something approaching professional curiosity. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable, as if Sarah's measured response had finally bridged the gap between his civilian understanding and the reality of her military background. "Can you be more specific about the nature of this training?" he asked, "without compromising whatever security protocols you need to maintain." Sarah felt the familiar weight of classified boundaries pressing against her consciousness, but she recognized that some information could be shared without crossing lines that could never be uncrossed. The bailiff had moved closer, his attention focused entirely on her words, and she noticed something in his posture that suggested recognition dawning in his mind. "Your Honor, I received training in close-quarters combat, advanced marksmanship, tactical movement, and specialized operations that prepared me to operate independently in hostile environments. The skills demonstrated in that parking lot represent a small fraction of my capabilities, applied with significant restraint given the civilian context." The courtroom gallery stirred slightly, the weight of her words settling over them like a revelation of hidden depths they had never imagined. The prosecutor had stopped shuffling through her papers, her attention now completely focused on Sarah with an expression that mixed professional interest and growing respect. "Ms. Chen," Judge Harrison said slowly, "when you say specialized operations, are we discussing the type of military service that involves classified missions in foreign countries?" Sarah recognized the moment when careful truth-telling required precise navigation between disclosure and security. She had reached the boundary where she could acknowledge reality without revealing specifics, where honesty could coexist with operational security. "Your Honor," she replied, "I can confirm that my service included assignments that required security clearances and operational discretion. The specific details of those assignments remain classified, but the training I received prepared me to handle exactly the type of situation that occurred in that parking lot." The bailiff stepped forward slightly, his movement catching everyone's attention. "Your Honor," he said in a voice that carried years of military bearing, "if I may interject, the defendant's responses are consistent with someone who has served in special operations capacity. The level of combat effectiveness shown in that video, combined with her adherence to security protocols, suggests training that few service members receive." Judge Harrison turned to the bailiff with surprise, clearly not expecting input from that quarter. "Bailiff Martinez, you have military experience that allows you to evaluate these claims." The bailiff straightened to attention with unconscious precision. "Yes, Your Honor. 22 years Army, including deployments with personnel from various special operations units. I recognize the signs when I see them. This reminds us that everyone has hidden depths we never expect to discover," Sarah thought, watching the faces around the courtroom as understanding began to dawn in expressions that had been skeptical moments before. The validation from Bailiff Martinez rippled through the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water, creating waves of understanding that reached every corner of the room. Judge Harrison stared at Sarah with an expression that had transformed completely from his earlier condescension, now seeing her through the lens of someone who had served his country in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. "Bailiff Martinez," Judge Harrison said slowly, his voice carrying a new weight of respect, "based on your military experience, what is your assessment of the defendant's actions in that parking lot?" The bailiff looked at Sarah for a moment, then back at the judge, his bearing reflecting the discipline of someone who had spent decades in service to something larger than himself. "Your Honor, based on what I observed in that video footage, the defendant displayed textbook restraint and precision. She neutralized 3 threats with minimal force, ensured the safety of a civilian, and contained the situation without causing permanent injury to the aggressors. That level of control under pressure indicates training that goes far beyond standard military instruction." Sarah felt something she had not experienced in months, a sense of being truly seen and understood by someone who grasped the weight of the choices she had made. The bailiff's words carried the authority of shared experience, the recognition that passed between those who had operated in spaces where life and death decisions were measured in seconds. The prosecutor rose slowly, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a growing understanding of the case she had been trying. "Your Honor, in light of this testimony and the defendant's service record, I believe we need to reconsider the charges against Ms. Chen. Her actions appear to constitute textbook defense of another person, executed with professional competence and appropriate restraint." Judge Harrison nodded, his gaze moving between Sarah, the bailiff, and the frozen image on the video monitor that showed 3 men sprawled across the parking lot pavement. The morning had begun with his assumptions about a simple assault case, but those assumptions had been systematically dismantled by evidence he had never anticipated encountering. "Ms. Chen," he said, his voice now carrying the tone of someone addressing an equal rather than a subordinate, "this court owes you an apology. I made assumptions about your background and capabilities based on incomplete information and personal prejudices that have no place in judicial proceedings." The courtroom gallery had grown completely silent, absorbing the dramatic reversal they were witnessing. People who had entered expecting routine morning justice were instead observing something unprecedented, a moment when hidden truths transformed understanding in ways that would be discussed long after they left the building. Sarah remained in her respectful posture, but something had shifted in her bearing, a subtle relaxation that suggested the burden of maintaining her cover had finally been lifted. "Your Honor," she replied quietly, "I understand the difficulty of evaluating situations without complete information. My training taught me that assumptions can be dangerous, regardless of the context in which they occur. Share this story with someone who needs to understand that we should never judge others based on appearances alone," Sarah thought, watching the faces around her transform with newfound respect and understanding. The morning sun had reached its full strength, casting the courtroom in brilliant light that seemed to illuminate corners that had been hidden in shadow moments before. Judge Harrison looked at his papers, then back at Sarah, clearly struggling with how to proceed in a situation for which no legal precedent existed. The case before him had evolved far beyond simple assault charges into something that touched on service, sacrifice, and the hidden heroes who protected civilian life in ways that could never be fully acknowledged. Judge Harrison set down his gavel with deliberate care, the sound echoing through the transformed courtroom like a final punctuation mark on a morning that had redefined everyone's understanding of justice, service, and the hidden depths that exist within seemingly ordinary people. The weight of his earlier prejudices hung in the air like a lesson that would not soon be forgotten. "Ms. Chen," he said, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who had been fundamentally changed by the preceding hours, "in light of the testimony presented and the evidence before this court, I am dismissing all charges against you. Your actions in that parking lot were not only legally justified but represent the highest standards of civilian protection and personal restraint." The courtroom gallery erupted in quiet murmurs of approval and amazement, people turning to each other with expressions that mixed relief and wonder. They had witnessed something unprecedented, a complete transformation of perspective that had moved from condemnation to celebration in the space of a single morning. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, raising his voice slightly to address the entire courtroom, "This case serves as a reminder to all of us about the dangers of making assumptions based on appearances. Ms. Chen's service to our country, though largely invisible to civilian eyes, has clearly prepared her to protect others with skills and judgment that deserve our respect and gratitude. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she had carried since leaving military service months earlier. The transition to civilian life had been harder than any mission she had ever undertaken, requiring her to hide the very capabilities that had defined her adult existence. But in this moment, surrounded by people who finally understood something of what she represented, she felt a sense of recognition that had been missing from her new life. The prosecutor approached Sarah's table, extending her hand with genuine respect. "Ms. Chen," she said quietly, "thank you for your service to our country, both in uniform and in that parking lot. The elderly woman you protected will never know how fortunate she was to have someone with your training nearby when she needed help." Bailiff Martinez stepped forward as the courtroom began to empty, his bearing reflecting the mutual recognition that passed between those who had served in dangerous places. "Ma'am," he said simply, "it was an honor to serve in the same courtroom with you today. Your restraint and professionalism under hostile questioning showed the same discipline that kept you alive overseas." Sarah shook his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of years spent maintaining weapons and equipment, the evidence of someone who understood the weight of responsibility that came with protecting others. "Thank you, Bailiff Martinez. Your support made a difference when it mattered most." Judge Harrison had remained seated, watching the interactions with an expression that suggested he was still processing the magnitude of his morning's education. As the courtroom cleared, he called out to Sarah one final time. "Ms. Chen," he said, his voice carrying genuine humility, "I hope you can forgive an old judge for learning an important lesson about judgment itself. This country is fortunate to have people like you serving in ways that most of us will never fully understand or appreciate." The afternoon sun was streaming through the courthouse windows as Sarah walked toward the exit, her steps lighter than they had been in months. Behind her, the courtroom stood empty except for the lingering echoes of a morning that had transformed assumptions into understanding, prejudice into respect, and a simple assault case into a powerful reminder that heroes often walk among us in the most unexpected forms, carrying secrets that protect the very people who might never know their names or understand the price of their safety.